Thank you for joining today for this session on how to win more work through frameworks. I think we had over 150 people sign up for this webinar, so clearly it's a topic that there's lots of interest out there. So thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to join me today and go through some of the material that we're going through. Just to introduce myself very quickly, I'm Lloyd from Tussell. My background is in procurement, so I did about 7 or 8 years in procurement, latterly as a procurement consultant. I then started my own bid consultancy firm, helping businesses win business with the government. And now I'm at Tussell, so I've got this kind of helicopter, or both a kind of macro view of what's going on in the market and a kind of micro view of what's going on in the market through our data. So hopefully that's a kind of good reason to trust a little bit in what I say, but you can decide for yourselves. So let's get started. So first of all, why did this webinar come about? Well, there was a single question that really sparked the idea for this webinar. I was contacted by a gentleman who works for a large kind of digital transformation company, and he posed a question to me, and it was essentially along the lines of, I've got this technical issue, Lloyd. For some reason, we're not getting frameworks arrive to us. It must be a problem with the systems that we're running or something about the portals that we're using. And I kind of reflected on that and thought, I'm not really sure that would be the reason. I mean, it could be part of the reason, but hopefully today I'm going to sort of debunk the myth that maybe it's to do with the technical reason. And actually there's much more to why you might not be winning work through frameworks. And we're going to talk about that in this session. So hopefully lots to learn for people on the call. So for those of you who've been around frameworks a long time, apologies, we're going to start with the very basics at the beginning. We've got a real range of attendees on this call, so I want to make sure everybody's catered for. It will be short and sweet. So what is a framework to start off with? A framework is essentially like a preferred supplier list that's used in the public sector. So let's work through an example for fire alarms. You've got this person on the left side of your screen. They work in procurement. They want to set up a framework agreement, and they're going to do it on fire alarms. And they effectively break that down into 3 lots: supply, repair, and testing. So it's almost kind of 3 frameworks within a framework. And they say, right, which suppliers should I have on my preferred supplier list? So they go out to the market, and there's all these suppliers who want to be on the framework, and they decide, we don't want any of you in the market, we just want these 3. And they effectively award the framework to these 3 suppliers. In lot 1, there's full competition with all 3 companies on there. Lot 2, there's just 2. And lot 3 is kind of the holy grail for frameworks, the kind of single supply situation where in theory you should get all the work for testing in this example. So that's essentially how they work. They work like a preferred supplier list. But there are kind of 2 ways that work can be awarded through frameworks, and they're quite different. One is direct award, and one is through mini competition. So let's look at those individually. Direct award, kind of as it says on the tin really, it's when a buyer uses that framework and effectively just gives you the contract. There's no extra kind of negotiation or tender process or anything like that. By contrast, mini competition is effectively a kind of mini tender that happens just between those people who are on the framework, where the buyer is trying to get best price or improve terms or whatever it might be, and then they decide who to award the work to, and after that the contract is awarded. So why do buyers use frameworks? What's the point? Well, it allows faster compliant procurement in following the kind of procurement rules that exist in the UK. It allows them to consolidate spend. That's kind of procurement speak. That really means they can get better deals because all the money is going to a smaller number of suppliers. It gives them what we call leverage. It allows them to get better deals, and also it reduces costs. Procurement's expensive stuff if you keep running all of these procurement processes, so it makes things a bit faster. And there are other benefits like pre-agreed terms, conditions, and things like that. So everything just runs in a much kind of smoother, faster way. But also there's something else to consider, and this, lots of you on the call may be aware of this, but some may not be. In a lot of situations, it's actually to generate income, and that works by framework providers actually charging a small kind of fee for people to access, not to access the framework as such, but when work is awarded to suppliers, they're almost charged a small fee, which goes to the framework provider. And we'll talk about that in a moment. So coming to the end of this bit shortly. So there's different types of frameworks that you need to be aware of. There's ones with a single contracting authority. This is, say, a local council sets up a framework just for that council. Multiple contracting authorities, this is where a single person sets up the framework, but it can be used for, say, everybody in the police service can use this framework, for example. And then there are kind of pan-government or pan-public sector frameworks, and examples, CCS are good examples where effectively anybody from the public sector can use the framework, and I think they're even open to private sector organisations as well. So quite different. From my perspective, most of the frameworks we see are more to the right of this chart that are kind of open to more people, but there are ones that kind of close off just to certain buyers. And that's the basics. That's as basic as it gets for those of you who are a bit more kind of advanced in your level of knowledge. But I wanted to just look at the kind of macro picture now in terms of the data. So this is where we're looking at the macro data in the Tussell database and understand what's happening with frameworks. So what this slide is showing you in the light green bars, that is how many new frameworks have been awarded over the last 5 years. So you can see there's been an increase of about 40% between 2017 and 2021. So there's kind of incremental, consistent growth in the number of new frameworks being awarded. But the green line I found really interesting, and that is that the number of people on frameworks is actually reducing. So the number of suppliers listed on each framework has dropped from 21 down to 12. So that is creating more of a kind of closed shop of these frameworks. And we've got the procurement bill coming in soon. And there's this idea of open frameworks. And I think this might be one of the measures to try and address having this kind of closed shop. So frameworks are on the up, there's fewer suppliers per framework. Now we're looking at call-off value. So call-offs are the contracts awarded under frameworks. And this slide is showing us the value of all of the call-offs, Tussell, 50,000 call-offs that Tussell has matched so far. But we've taken out the COVID contracts from 2021. If we kept those in, there would be a massive spike in 2021, I think up to about 30 billion. But to give a more realistic kind of trajectory of growth, and this really shows how many contracts, the value of contracts being awarded under frameworks. So there's lots of massive figures thrown around with frameworks. Those of you who've been around a while will know this. A kind of procurement person will say, oh, this framework's worth 10 billion. And in reality, 500 million might go through the framework in its life. So you always have to be a bit careful with the figures associated with the frameworks themselves. But for call-off value here, this is where we see the kind of true value of what's going on. And again, we see this consistent increase in the use of frameworks. And finally, just the last one on some sort of macro numbers. This is the one I found most interesting. The number of call-offs has really accelerated. So we're going from 3,500 in 2017 up to some 13,000 in 2021. And yes, the average value of those call-offs has actually increased as well, but just the sheer volume of activity that is going on under frameworks can't be denied. So there you go, that's the full picture. Frameworks are growing, there's fewer suppliers on them, there's loads more activity going through frameworks in general, but I guess many of you know that, and that's why you're on the call today. So I won't stick on that point for too much longer. So what are we going to cover today in terms of the areas that I'm going to speak about? We're going to do something slightly different for Tussell, and we're going to talk outside of the data, but we'll speak about mindset, and I think this is so important to winning business through frameworks. The data, which clearly is very important, and then the action. So what practical steps can you take to improve your performance in frameworks? So let's get cracking. Let's firstly talk about mindset. So your mindset and your team. So I think a mindset shift is really needed from kind of your current thinking to new thinking, or maybe you're already on the journey to new thinking, or hopefully you're already there. So what do I mean by this? First of all, if you think, great, we're on a framework, we can just kind of relax and let the work roll in, I'm afraid that's probably not going to work that well for you. I really believe a mindset shift is needed to say, good start, we're now on a framework, now the hard work really begins. And I think if you make that switch, it's going to be really important. So an emphasis on hard work. I know people put a lot of effort into getting onto frameworks, but really the hard work does start once you're on it. The next point, we're on the framework, buyers should just be coming to us, right? They should just kind of roll up and knock on the door. Well, maybe, but that's not really the best mindset you can have to get the most out of frameworks. Really, that should change to, we can't expect buyers to come to us. We need to educate, support, and promote. And I'll talk to you later in the presentation about how you do that, but you really need to get behind these buying organizations and help them figure out that frameworks are the right option for them. And lastly, kind of chuckle at this one, buyers should be aware of this framework already. It's mandatory. Well, to my mind, to my knowledge, there aren't really any mandatory frameworks in the public sector, or at least they're not really managed in that way. I think CCS have a good coverage and get a lot of usage, for example, on their frameworks, but they're not necessarily mandatory. As a procurement person, you want them to be used, but it doesn't really work like that. So what's the change in mindset change that's needed, excuse me? I would start thinking like, let's assume nobody knows about the framework. And it's a strange way of thinking about it, but if you have that mindset, every conversation you go into, assume that people have got no idea that the framework even exists, that will help you. And I'll go on to explain why that happens now. So let's flip it and go and look at the buyer's perspective as they go through this journey. Before we do that, just a quick reality check. The first point is that procurement people are always involved. And I say they're always involved. This is in the setup of the framework, not necessarily in the awarding of the call-off contracts through the framework, but in the setting up of a framework. So it's worth just kind of understanding how procurement people think. The next point, which is important, nobody ever set up a framework thinking it wouldn't be used. But we know from the data, and we know when we speak to people, and from my own experience, a lot of them don't get a lot of usage. So why might that happen? Well, in some cases, a framework isn't the right answer. And it's kind of an unusual thing to admit. In my procurement career, I worked with colleagues who couldn't even really articulate what a framework was and why they were using it versus just a normal contract, for example. So you might be thinking, why am I not getting the kind of the traction with this framework? And actually it's just because it should never have been a framework in the first place, or someone's just rerunning a framework that someone ran 4 years ago and they don't really understand why they're using a framework. So bear that in mind. I'm not saying it happens all the time, but it definitely does happen. And the next point is getting buy-in from your own authority is hard. And what do I mean by that? We'll talk through that again a bit more in a second, but it's effectively getting people to come on the journey with you and kind of agree to engage with your framework. And that is difficult. And post-award communication is often neglected. What does that mean? It means that people award the framework and they just kind of forget to tell people about it. So nobody really realizes it's happening. And lastly, compliance is often the primary goal, but it's never easy. And compliance in this sense means getting people to actually use your framework. If you set one up for travel services, for example, trying to get people to not go and do their own thing with their travel, but actually use your framework, that's the primary goal, but it is very hard. So that's the kind of reality from the procurement perspective. And I can tell you from firsthand experience, that's what it's like. So now let's quickly go through the journey of how a framework's set up very quickly. So there's this person here, let's call them John. John he works in procurement and he wants to set up a framework. Who does he want to set that up for? Well, these 5 people that work in his local council, let's say. So he thinks, great, they need a fire alarm framework. I'm going to set a new one up and it's going to serve them. But then he thinks, well, wait, I could maybe get a better deal if I involve a couple more local authorities or parts of the public sector. So I'm going to open my framework up and include those people as well. So he starts off with these really great intentions and he's thinking, okay, I've got 10 people who will use this framework. It's going to be great. It's all going to work out perfectly. But then what happens? So let's walk through the reality of the end of the framework. So at the end of the process, this framework agreement is in place and there's effectively 3 camps of people on the framework. There's the happy people. So there's a couple of people from from the local council he works at. They're really happy with the framework. They're happy with the suppliers on it, the terms and conditions. They're really pleased that it's been set up and they're absolutely going to use it. So that's 2 out of the 10 he's got so far. Then another 5 people, there's 3 from his own local council and there's 2 from the neighbouring council. And actually they're not happy at all. They don't like the suppliers. They don't really like John that much. He's run the process in a way they didn't really like. He's not achieved buy-in at all. So those 5 people, as they sit here today, they just don't want to use the framework. They don't want to engage with it. And John was so busy running the process and so stressed with it all, he actually forgot to tell one of the other councils about the framework at all. So they just literally don't even know it exists. He didn't communicate it to them in any way. So what happens? Well, in this situation, only 2 out of 10 people actually have got any intention of ever using this framework. So what happens? Suppliers say, where's my work? And they should, because they've been sold this dream by John that they're going to have 10 customers, 10 million in framework value, and in reality, they might be getting 2. So for you, as somebody who wants to sell on this framework, your potential market is still all of these 10 people. You could, in theory, convince all of these 10 people to buy from your framework, but you've got a lot of work to do on those 8 that weren't brought into the process in the first place. I've got some tips and tricks later in exactly how you can do that, but I thought it was important to kind of frame the reality. And I'm not saying this happens in all framework processes. Some of them go really well. They might have 9 out of those 10 on board. You know, some might have even fewer, but this is just the reality. And next, I thought it was important to talk about this extra layer of complexity now in what I'm calling the battle for attention. So what do I mean by that? What I mean is there are lots and lots of framework providers out there, tons of them. Basically, almost every government department, every council, whatever, sets out their own frameworks. And there are lots of other framework providers as well, ESPO, NEPO, WIPO, Pagabo, Scape, all these different companies, and they're all trying to get the attention of people who want to buy, all these kind of potential customers of yours. They want them to use their framework. So there's this kind of constant battle for your attention and your work to go through their frameworks. So how does this play out in reality? You end up with a kind of dilemma. Really, there's almost too many choices for buyers. So these people at the top, they're your potential customers. If you want to sell into the government, you are trying to influence all these people at the top to do what you want them to do. And let's say it's cybersecurity services that they're looking to buy. There's at least 3 framework options that they could go to. They could go to one that their local council set up, that is set up for the police. They could go for a CCS one that's covering the whole of the whole of government. It's up to them really where they choose. But then it gets even more complicated because everyone at the top of this kind of slide thinks that they're special and important and that their needs have to be met in a particular way. So what might happen? Well, they might actually say, you know what, I want my own framework. None of these 3 frameworks actually serve my needs. I'm going to go and set up my own. And this is what drives this kind of proliferation of frameworks, I think, in the public sector is you're not driving people to these 3. They're just thinking, okay, I'm going to go and set another one up. Or an even worse kind of outcome, if you're one of the framework providers or a supplier on one of these frameworks, they just think, you know what, this is a bit, it's a bit complicated, or they've not heard about the framework, or for whatever reason, they just set up a contract, a direct one-to-one contract with a supplier, and they just ignore the framework altogether. So hopefully you can see from this slide that you're in this battle for attention. If you're on the framework for, say, this blue procurement person at the bottom here, you're in a fight with all these other framework providers for the attention of these buyers to get them to use your framework. Hopefully that just helps you think about the mindset and framing it, the sort of challenge that you've got. So let's talk about data and insights for a moment, which is Tussell's speciality. I'm going to give you 5 examples of how you can use data on frameworks to make a step change in your sales and business development activity in the public sector. I've got to say at the outset, all of this is using Tussell's data and Tussell's platform. And the reason is, frankly, it's practically impossible to get this information at scale in any other way. I'm not saying you can't do it, but it would probably take you months, and it's going to take a lot of energy and effort to go and get it. And even then, you're probably going to have to focus on just a few buyers to try and figure out which frameworks they're using, etc. So this has only been around for about a year's time now. We've got all of that information together, cleaned it, and matched call-off contracts to frameworks. So I'm going to show you what that looks like with a few examples. So first of all, how do you find the most valuable frameworks for your company? So in this example, we're going to use one of our saved searches, kind of complex saved searches, which are set up for our clients on PPE. And you can see on the left-hand side, all of those search terms have been set up. So we can now see 264 frameworks at the top here that are linked to PPE. And then if we go to the framework ranking tab, you can see what the most valuable frameworks are by value and by volume. So very quickly, you've got the answer to that question. You know, if you want to sell PPE into the public sector, what are the right frameworks? Now I'm going to go and use a simple kind of CPV code, common procurement vocabulary. I'm going to choose chemical products, and just in a couple of seconds, we've figured out what the most kind of valuable and used frameworks are on chemical products in the public sector. So if you want to find out what the most used and valuable frameworks are for your firm, that's how you can do it in a couple of seconds. How would you get more out of your existing frameworks? So let's take this example. Let's say you're on DOS, or Digital Outcomes and Specialists 5, the kind of latest version of this. How do you get more out of this? Well, by going onto this frameworks page in Tussell, you can now click search for relevant call-offs, and you're going to be shown all of the call-offs which relate to this this particular framework agreement, there's 219. So if you're sitting there thinking, I haven't won any work through this framework agreement, this view will show you the people who have won work through this framework agreement and who they're doing it with. So let's just let that play through a little bit. This is currently showing everybody, and now we're going to go into the buyer ranking view, and we're going to see, okay, well, which buyers are engaging with this framework agreement? The answers are there. So these are the people who are kind of already bought into using this framework agreement and are buying from it already. And just very quickly, we can search for central government and local government to see who's, again, mostly through local government on this one, through central government, sorry, and then through local government, it's not used as much. That could be seen as both a problem or an opportunity. It really just depends what your strategy is. You could use those as examples with local government to say, hey, these councils have bought through this agreement, why don't you do it too? Or you might say, actually, there's just not enough to go after there. We'll focus on central government as well. There's no right answer to your strategy. Now we're going for a supplier ranking view. So this now tells me which suppliers are doing lots of business through this framework. And let's use Capgemini as an example. And we could say, okay, well, we're doing pretty well going up against Capgemini at the moment. So let's see what call-offs they've won through this framework, and we can see all of them in a second. And then finally, we can do a view on expiring contracts, which I realized I actually did wrong in this video by selecting contracts which are expiring in the next 12 months. I actually chose contracts which expired in the previous 12 months, which is not very useful. But if you did it with the frameworks expiring in the next 12 months, you can build a pipeline of expiring deals on this framework. You can download them, put them into your pipeline. So that's how you get more from an existing framework. Next, discover which frameworks buyers actually use. Well, it's quite important. As I said earlier, some of them ignore certain frameworks, some of them use them heavily. So let's go and have a quick look at that and see what it looks like. There's a few different ways you can do this in the Tussell platform. If you just type the buyer's name in this example, I'm using DEFRA, I believe, and just answering the question, okay, which frameworks they're using. I'm choosing call-offs to say, show me all the call-off contracts. And then we can quickly go to the framework ranking and see which ones are the most used. I won't stay on this whole recording, so I think I'm just looking at things from a few different perspectives here, but there's the answer in just a few seconds. Moving on. This one's really important, and it's two ways of thinking about how suppliers are performing on frameworks. One is as competitors, and one is as potential partners. So in terms of partners, who can you partner with to get access to these frameworks, especially if you're locked out for a period of time. Remember, some of them can be 4 years long or longer. So if you've just missed a really important framework and you can't get onto it, you might want to partner up with somebody else. Equally, you might want to go after your competitors' opportunities. So let's have a look through that. I'll save myself a bit of time and just fast forward. So I think we've done, that's it, Byte Software and Phoenix Software as two examples. And we're now saying, okay, show me all of the frameworks that these two companies are winning work through. So we can see at the top there, 436 worth nearly $500 million. So a massive amount of opportunity either to just go and work with them and partner with them on the frameworks, or look at what deals they've got under frameworks and try and challenge for those. I'm just going to skip forward a little bit here. And equally, we can do it by buyer ranking. So it's just a different way of looking at the same thing. Which buyers have they got good relationships with in terms of using frameworks, and then figuring out how that fits into your own kind of strategy and business development plans. And the very last one, and we talked about driving kind of volume and traffic to these frameworks and why that's so important for buyers before. In this example, we're going to find a contract which is not being used on a framework, that's not a call-off contract, and we're going to try and influence somebody to use the framework that we're on next time. So let's see how that plays out. So in this example, I use a search for penetration testing, which is kind of a cybersecurity activity, and I'm going to look for local government opportunities, and then I will say, okay, it has to be a call-off. And when sorry, it's not a call-off. So I'm basically saying which deals are not currently using frameworks. And I spot one down here, which is £200,000 with Bristol City Council for IT health check and penetration testing. So why does that matter? Kind of what's the so what? Well, you can get in touch with the person at Bristol City Council. You can use the key decision maker data we've got in Tussell. You can try and contact them via LinkedIn or try and contact them directly somehow. And you can basically say to them, look, you've had this contract that you weren't running through a framework. How about we've got a framework that does this sort of thing already. Why don't you save yourself the hassle and just award this sort of work next time directly through the framework? So you're actually helping channel this activity through the framework. Hopefully that makes sense. My 10-second pitch for Tussell on this point, just a reminder, this data has only been around for about a year. So if you've never seen it before, it's probably worth having a look at. And kind of public sector market intelligence as a thing has probably only been around 5 years. So if you've never kind of thought about this or thought about how it would fit into your sales and marketing workflow, I'd encourage you to just go and have a look. Okay, now on to the kind of the meat and bones of this webinar and all of the advice I'm giving you today. And it's what action should you really be taking that's going to make a difference? Hopefully your mindset is right. You're thinking about these things in the right way, thinking, okay, maybe nobody even knows about this framework. I understand the dilemmas that buyers have got. I get that. I'm ready for it. I've got the data behind me. I'm kind of empowered to go after the right opportunities. But how should you actually do it? Because this is tough as well, right? So the first bit of advice I'd give you is actually talking to your marketing teams and thinking about how they can help you. And really it's about having a comm strategy. And that sounds like quite a big thing for a framework, but especially if this framework's going to be kind of core to you selling to the public sector, you really need to think about how to make your voice as loud as possible. Think of that kind of battle for attention that I talked about earlier. You've got all these different framework providers, all this noise. Buyers don't know which framework to use or whether they should set their own up or do a contract instead. You need to kind of shout loud enough that they know that you're on that framework and that it exists. So what can they do? Launch and promo emails, just letting people know that you're out there. You can work with the buyer or the contracting authority to kind of help send these messages out through their channels. Or again, you can use some of the key decision-making data that we've got in Tussell to try and amplify that reach a little bit. And case study material, this is more important in the public sector than the private sector, in my opinion. Public sector buyers really value if you've worked in the public sector before. So it really makes sense to have a case study where somebody's used your framework, how beneficial and fast it was for them to use it, and what the benefits were of them using it on that framework, not just in general for the public sector. Then things like videos and fact sheets, you might think, wow, this is all getting a bit out of hand, but actually, again, you need to shout loud enough and be heard, then the volume and the traffic will come through the framework and you'll benefit from it. And finally, website and landing pages. So I've got a few examples of these that I'll just talk through with you, and I think they're quite important to kind of shouting loud about what you do. But firstly, on videos and fact sheets. So this is an example that I've got for you from Agito. I think I'm saying that right. It's part of Capita. And effectively, here's a video on the left of them promoting why people should use this particular framework. So a video about the launch. And on the right, there's a fact sheet there, which really explains how do you use it? Why should you use it? What can you buy from it and everything else? So I'm asking you the question, have your sales teams got this sort of collateral that can help them go out to the market and really sell the framework and the benefits of it and just let people know that it exists? That's really the point of all this stuff. And then let's look at some website examples. So Graham, a nice simple one. The reason I pulled Graham out is because if you see on the top navigation bar of their website, it actually just has a big link that just says frameworks. So to me, that says this company is pretty serious about doing business through frameworks. The evidence is there. They're on 50 plus frameworks. They've done $1 billion of value of works through them, et cetera, et cetera. And it talks about all the different frameworks they're on. It's a great point of reference that people can be sent to. And Bytes is an example where it's a bit more defined. They're calling out specific frameworks they're on. And what I quite like about this is they are given a specific email address that you can go to if you're interested in doing work through that framework. I think that was quite cute. And Insight, I thought this was really interesting as well. They've got a kind of downloadable guide that you can download if you're interested in doing work through the public sector with them. But this was a really interesting part further down as well. The top bit is they're really communicating a recent win. We're proud to be on this framework. So they're really shouting about this new framework they're on. But the bottom bit I really loved. They've actually called out where people can do direct awards or further competitions through their frameworks, which I thought was a really nice touch. Imagine kind of sending customers to this page and hopefully that just clears everything up. And I'll come back to Agito again just quickly. It's quite interesting. I think this is a single source travel and events deal that they've got with the government or had. And effectively, it just tells people why they should direct award and takes them through a kind of step-by-step process of how they really use the framework. I thought that was very cool. And a blog on the kind of benefits of using the framework and why it saves people time and money. So again, this is all about just the marketing team giving you the collateral you need to be able to sell more effectively. So go ask your marketing teams for some help. And if you haven't got a marketing team, think about how you can do this stuff yourselves. Okay, the next point, which I think is really important, and it's about turning your sales team into educators, promoters, and advocates of your framework. And there's two sets of people you need to really do this with. It's the kind of buyers or the customers, so the people who are buying from your framework. They probably want your solution. They almost want just the fastest way to do business with you. A lot of the time, they're not using your framework. It might just be because they've already got another favorite framework, or they just don't know about your framework or something like that. So you've got work to do in educating them and promoting your framework, etc. For procurement people, remember, they need all the help they can get. Success for them is people actually using their framework. That's how they save money. That's how they get a pat on the back from their boss. That's what success looks like, people actually using their frameworks. So what can you do in reality? So for customers, it's all about making it simple for them. These are the people who are actually going to buy stuff through your framework. Again, I said this at the beginning, just assume they don't know about the framework at all. When you're ringing somebody up, if you've got salespeople ringing people up and trying to sell them things for $2 grand, $5 grand, whatever it is through your framework, nice, simple things, just assume they don't even know it exists and start with that point and really think about educating them on why they should use it and why they shouldn't do something else. Next, sounds simple, but let them know they're allowed to use it, that they're one of the buyers who's actually allowed to use the framework. Let them know how to use it. Frameworks operate differently. Some require forms, some require portals, some you might have to call somebody, whatever it might be, but let them know the process they have to go through to buy. And as I said earlier, give real examples of how others have used it, so how other people have benefited from using this specific framework. The fifth point, educate them on why it's a good route to market. It's faster, it's compliant. You're not going to have the hassle of running your own solution. Here's all the other people who've used it. They didn't. They've had a great experience, and you can send them to those people. And yeah, just make it easy to do business with you. I used the example earlier of Bytes having this specific email address. So how can you kind of reduce friction of somebody buying through that framework? And next, think about the people in procurement as your kind of as kind of partners. They've got a tough job in trying to get people to use these frameworks. So remember, you've got the same goals, framework use. You're literally on the same team. You should be talking to these people and using them as kind of teammates and partners, and not kind of fighting against them. Find ways to cooperate, to co-promote the framework. So how can you both be sending the messages out? How can you do kind of joint events, joint marketing around this sort of activity? Link them up with the people from the previous slide. It would be great if I was in my procurement days, if suppliers came to me and said, hey, I found all these other people who are interested in the framework. Can you just talk to them to give them some reassurance, or to kind of talk to them about why it might be good to use the framework? So, team up those two groups of people, and that will really help build the relationship. And again, a relationship builder, schedule regular catch-ups with you. You might think, oh, the procurement's done now, I've moved on. If you've got the person who set up that framework on your side, especially if it's a relatively successful framework with a lot of business going through it, having that person on your team and having them kind of singing from the same hymn sheet as you is really going to help you out. And finally, share your results and help kind of build that sense of teamwork. And now we've kind of gone full circle to framework profiles. It's my personal opinion that this is a bit of a, is it a red herring is the right saying? I don't think this is really where your focus and your attention should be. Let me tell you from experience, if somebody really wants to buy something from you, if a buyer is desperate to buy your services, these kind of technical issues on portals and profiles and things like that will not be a problem. If you've got 100 people who you've warmed up to your service, you've promoted to them right, you've sold to them right, you'll just have a kind of tidal wave of interest, and they'll be knocking on your door saying, hey, your portal's not set up quite right, here's how you do it. And actually, I'm gonna kind of just say something about this. Part of this advice comes from a gentleman I spoke to, which I'll talk to on the next slide. It's not necessarily my advice. Honestly, I don't know the best way to configure these portals necessarily, because all buyers are using those portals in a different way. Some of them might ignore them. Some of them might use the search functionality very extensively. You just don't know. The best way of finding that out is actually just speak to the buyer and build a good relationship with them. And then all of this technical stuff just gets sorted out. But for what it's worth, here's the kind of points that this person made. So ensure reliable access to the portals, just make sure that they're on and they're set up properly. Keep your profile up to date with applicable product and service codes. Ensure your certificates are listed and in date, things like ISO accreditation, Cyber Essentials, all that stuff. Make sure it's properly referenced in case people filter on those activities or search for those. And avoid going too wide. I think there'll be some of you sitting on this call saying, well, we'd just like to have any deal come through. But actually, if you're a successful company that's had loads of work coming through frameworks, you actually don't want to set up your profile too wide, because you'll get lots of unsuitable opportunities coming your way, and you're going to waste a lot of energy and effort just filtering those out. So try and make sure they're kind of neatly set up. And remember, as I said at the beginning, if there's a mini competition, like a mini tender that happens within that framework, if that's the first time that you're hearing about it, remember that's basically at the end of the discovery process for the buyer. They've already probably made their minds made up on the type of supplies that they want, and they've gone through that process. So if that's the first time you're hearing about it, you've just got to remember they're already towards the end of their process already. So have those conversations early and engage early. So my next bit of advice is around looking at appointing a frameworks champion, or at least a frameworks lead. And this comes off the back of a really great conversation I had with a gentleman called Neil. He works for a company called SAS, and he's a procurement framework specialist. His whole job is about making sure that people are using frameworks properly at SAS. And it was quite interesting because I'd practically written this entire webinar before I reached out to Neil, but it was interesting just how much his points resonated with me. So we asked him, what's the most common mistake that people make? Sitting back and waiting for the business to roll in. I mean, we've covered that more than enough on this call already. And then 3 common misconceptions. So the first one is that being on a framework guarantees business. It doesn't. It never really does. If someone in procurement's telling you that as you go through the process, they're probably telling you porkies, really. You have to work hard for that business once you're on the framework. And I know that, Neil knows that. That's the reality. And his second misconception is that everyone's playing by the rules. These are kind of my words now and not Neil's, but there's definitely an amount of people kind of tweaking pricing or kind of finding ways to maybe work around the framework or kind of flex and bend the rules a little bit. I certainly wouldn't advocate doing that. I don't think Neil would either. Doing it the right way is good for a long-term sustainable strategy and building good relationships in the public sector. So use the proper channels and use the proper means and follow the kind of rules of the framework, if you like. And lastly, which is something I can definitely relate to, and this is that customers will always behave as you expect, by which we mean that people are going to come through that process and buy from you in a very kind of linear and repeatable way, and they're all going to behave in exactly the same way. They won't. If you take something like G-Cloud, some people will just call you up, some people will find your profile on the site, some people will realize that you're on G-Cloud because you mentioned it on your website. They'll come to you in all types of different ways. Every single buyer or customer, as Neil's calling them, is going to engage with you in a slightly different way. And you can never really predict how they're going to behave. So treat each opportunity as unique. You'll be pleased to know we're coming near at the end of the session now. So one of the final points I would make to you is about creating a feedback loop. This might be quite tricky to do, but I think this does require a kind of internal champion or internal lead within the business. So make sure when you're having conversations with customers or buyers, as I might call them, or the people responsible for setting up the frameworks, make sure that all of that information is kind of fed back centrally and you're really reacting to what you're being told. Also with your sales and marketing teams, what's working, what isn't working, what messaging are we using that's kind of resonating with people and what isn't, and feed that back. If you want a real control and kind of grasp of what's happening with frameworks, I'd really recommend this as an approach. So that comes to the end of the advice. I'm going to give you a few predictions now, break and mold. We don't normally do this at Tussell, but I think the data and the kind of anecdotal stuff is so overwhelming. I think it's worth doing. The first one is frameworks are going to continue to be used a lot, and I expect their usage to just increase and increase over time. They've become one of the main kind of routes to market for buyers and suppliers. The next is a notable kind of uptake or increase in what we're calling open frameworks. If you've seen the government's procurement bill, the rules are changing for procurement in the UK. And these open frameworks, we talked about a closed shop earlier, they effectively mean after a certain period of time, frameworks that are, say, 8 years long, I think it's after 3 years, they're going to have to reopen and allow new suppliers to come in. So I expect those frameworks to become fairly standard, or at least get used very often. The third point is the rise in the use of DPSs, dynamic purchasing systems, or dynamic procurement systems. We haven't talked about those on this call too much. I wouldn't worry about them too much, in the sense that they're just, they're effectively a framework agreement that's always open. So when I say I wouldn't worry about them, they're just very similar to frameworks, except they're always open. So you can effectively jump onto a DPS at any time. There's no kind of, that could run for, say, 10 years, and that suppliers are literally allowed to jump on that whenever they want. We're already seeing, I think, not necessarily from a data perspective, but kind of anecdotally, and what we're seeing from a day-to-day basis, there is a kind of shift towards DPSs. And I think they're being used as a bit of a kind of stopgap solution between kind of traditional frameworks and these new open frameworks, and people are using DPSs more. So something to keep an eye out for. And ultimately, what we're seeing a lot in the conversations we're having at Tussell in the market is just more focus on this area from high growth and high performing companies. Those who are really interested in it are investing in it, and we're seeing that already. So a final recap of the session today before you go. Firstly, the right mindset is essential for business. I know it might sound a bit silly, but I really believe if you don't get your mindset right, and you're sitting there thinking, oh, all these opportunities are just going to land in our lap, and they told us that we would get this work, so it should just roll in. If you've got that mindset, that's really not a mindset for success. You really have to think, we have to work hard, we have to educate, we have to promote about our place on the framework. The second is that data can really unlock the true potential of frameworks. This information, this insight is new. I'd really encourage you to have a look at it and go and explore how data can help you. And as I've said already, success through frameworks really requires a kind of active rather than a passive approach. You really have to get busy. You have to take some of the advice I've given you today and put that into action. And at that point, you can really start to get the benefits of working through frameworks. And final point, most of the successful firms we're talking through are investing in this area, whether it's through people, whether it's through processes, whether it's through systems. Those who want to make a success of it are really investing slightly ahead of the curve. We're about to launch our new strategic suppliers report. In that report, it shows that those strategic suppliers, those 40 top companies, are really ahead of the curve in terms of their performance on frameworks. And I think they are really, they've invested in what they need to do in terms of people and processes to get ahead. And that's already kind of showing in the results. So that's it. That's the end of the session. If anybody's got any questions, again, please do drop them in the chat. But also, I'd love to hear your feedback, please. Whether you've enjoyed the session today or not, please do let me know. Give me a follow on LinkedIn. And if you've got any questions that we haven't been able to ask today, or you didn't want to ask on the session, I will take those afterwards as well. So thanks again for taking the time today, and enjoy the rest of your day.